Good morning, Hassan Huskies. This is your principal, Dr. Miller. Today is December 5th, 2023. Please stand with me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, Hassan Huskies. I hope you guys had a really great weekend. You got an extra day off yesterday, so I hope you got to play outside and get some fresh air and do lots of fun things with your families. I have birthdays. Happy birthday. All right, December birthdays. I have Anaya and Mrs. Stella, Quinn and Mr. Spitzak, Dax and Mrs. Meeker, Reed and Mrs. Wallen, Violet and Mrs. Stella, Vivian and Mrs. Stella, Theodore, Teddy and Mrs. Greenwald, Fiona and Mrs. Harns, Holden and Mrs. Stella, Jason and Mrs. Petter, Josephine and Mrs. Holloway, Stella and Mrs. Craig, and David and Mr. Spitzak. And I also have half birthdays. Happy June half birthday. Winifred and Mrs. Meeker, Jazeria and Mrs. Harns, Journey and Mr. Spitzak. I have Collins and Miss Doro, Riley and Mr. Willenbring, June and Mrs. Grant, Leo and Mrs. Greenwald, Kane and Mrs. Moline, Nima and Mrs. Greenwald, Blair and Miss Hanlon, Lex and Mrs. Cedargren, Carter and Ms. Dockendorf, Lexi and Mrs. Spalding, Kaylee and Mrs. Petter, Jakari and Miss Cedargrens, Hunter and Mrs. Cedargren, Grace and Mrs. Stella, Marshall and Mr. Willenbring, Evelyn and Mrs. Meeker, Colton and Mrs. Edie, Lydia and Mrs. Dazowski, Oliver and Mrs. Harns, Charlotte and Mrs. Harns, Thomas and Mrs. Spalding, David and Mrs. Grant, Grant and Mrs. Dockendorf, and Ty and Miss Stimmick. Happy half birthday. All right, all of my December and June birthdays, come on down and get a birthday book and pencil. Happy birthday. Hassan Huskies, remember, you belong here. It's a great day to be a Husky.